Good morning and welcome to everybody. We're going to begin our webcast today at this point. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, and Diane Lalonde is with me, Research Associate, the Learning Network. And we're so pleased to be bringing you the webcast Best Practice Engaging Male-Identified Students in Post-Secondary Sexual Violence Prevention Initiatives. Wherever you are on Turtle Island today, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. As settlers, we commit to making the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular, to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country. We're bringing the webcast today from the Learning Network, and we're delighted that one of our key partners, White Ribbon, are presenting the webcast, and we'll introduce our guest speaker in just a few moments. But first, I'd like to just review the format for today and some of the instructions. So our presenter is going to present for 45 minutes. And during this time, we invite you to enter any questions that you have in the question and answer box. And we'll be tracking those. And at the end of the presentation, we'll present them to our guest presenter so that he can respond. Also, at the end of the webcast, you will see in the chat box that there's a link to the evaluation. And this evaluation is really important. And it's the Learning Network evaluation. And it helps us plan future webcasts and our other webinar series as well. You'll also see a link to an evaluation that the White Ribbon and Draw the Line campaign would like you to complete as part of their initiative. And I'm sure David will talk a little bit more about that when he presents. There's also some other important links that Diane has put into the chat box. And you'll see there's a link to the slides that our guest presenter will be using. There's also links to resources if you want some support or emotional support in terms of listening to the content. So please just check those links and know that they're there for your benefit. Also, shortly after the webcast is finished in the next few days, so maybe by Monday or Tuesday, these slides and the recording of this webcast will be on the Learning Network website. You'll also see some additional links that will be posted as well on that page. And now it is our pleasure to introduce our guest presenter. David Garzon is a Community Engagement Manager at White Ribbon. He is in charge of facilitating workshops, trainings, and presentations for the Draw the Line initiative, as well as supporting other White Ribbon projects. He has worked in Bolivia, Guatemala, and Colombia, delivering workshops and implementing projects on gender equity, masculinities, LGBTQ+ rights, gender-based violence, feminism, youth empowerment, health, and fair trade. David holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and Latin American and Caribbean studies from York University, a certificate in critical reflections on masculinities from the Center for Social Research, Technology, and Capacity Building, and is currently finishing a postgraduate program in global business management at Humber College. And so we've got the right person presenting today, David, and we're delighted that you're with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Linda, and welcome everyone. I was just looking at the chat box, and I'm very happy to see that a lot of folks are joining from different locations in Canada. I'm currently in Toronto. I decided to take this webinar from home. because my internet seems to be a lot faster here because I'm the only one who uses it. Welcome everyone. Let me see. So as Linda said, my name is David Garzon. I am the Community Engagement Manager for White Ribbon, which is an organization that works to engage men and boys in conversations about gender equity, gender-based violence prevention, and masculinities. So I've decided to name this webinar Best Practices in Engaging Male-Identified Students in the Post-Secondary sector when talking about sexual violence prevention initiatives. And the purpose of this webinar is to revise some of the best practices that we've been implementing over the last 2 years, especially through the Draw the Line campaign. It's a project that has existed for a long while. I've been leading it for the last 2 years. And also taking into account some recent concerns that some community partners have brought in regards to the existence of boomerang effects, of backlash, and of negative repercussions of work on sexual violence prevention in the long term. So I know and I acknowledge that there are plenty of resources related to this topic online, and I didn't want to replicate any of that knowledge. Instead, I'm trying to elaborate on what exists. You'll find a lot of resources on male allyship. You'll find a lot of resources on bystander intervention. We know bystander intervention training is key when preventing sexual violence at the post-secondary sector. And you'll find a lot of information on creating cultures of consent, as well as facilitating workshops on consent knowledge and how to apply it on the lives of the students and give them the tools to use consent, right? So this is the agenda that I brought for today. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about White Ribbon. I'm going to tell you how we started, what our goals are. Then I'm going to be talking about the Draw Line campaign. This webinar itself is part of that campaign. We knew a lot of folks from the post-secondary sector were going to join, and so we made it part of that effort. Then I'm going to be speaking about some important considerations when engaging male-identified folks. These are all drawn, as I said, from a couple of research papers that have been brought to our attention in the last year. My own experience working with male-identified folks as part of White Ribbon and from before in Bolivia and Guatemala. And also based on a lot of observations I've been doing on our work of engaging men and boys, not only at White Ribbon, but in general. I've had the chance to take a couple webinars on the topic from Uruguay, from Bolivia, and I've seen that sometimes mistakes are made. Some mistakes are common when engaging men and boys. So I wanted to address this through these best practices that I'm going to propose. These are just little key points that could be mainstreamed into campaigns, workshops, any activity that aims to engage men and boys in conversations on sexual violence prevention and gender-based violence prevention. But again, I'm going to focus on the population of students at the post-secondary sector. And then I'm going to take a couple minutes to introduce our metric on sexual violence prevention. It's a tool for everyone to use. It's available on our website, but we'll get there. I'll speak about that at the end. So just to tell you a little bit about White Ribbon, as I mentioned, we're based in Toronto. This organization was created in 1991 as a response to the Montreal massacre. In 1991, folks around Canada were going to have the first day of remembrance after the Montreal massacre. And they were realizing that although a lot of women were taking part of the conversation in gender-based violence prevention, it wasn't the case for men. So a group of men in the city of Toronto decided to create the White Ribbon campaign, which was originally based around a pledge. Folks would come and sign this pledge in which they would commit to never condone or engage in violence against women, and would also never stay quiet about it, right? So we try to work mostly with male-identified folks, letting them know what their role is in ending gender-based violence, letting them know that they can do something. Now, something that I want to bring to your attention is that a lot of work, a lot of fantastic work has been done since the very unfortunate events of the Montreal massacre, but there is still a lot of work to do. 29 years after the Montreal massacre, we had the incidents represented on the picture of the right. This is a picture of the aftermath of the Toronto van attacks. And I'm talking about both of these events because they come from the same problem. They were both incidents in which a young man was frustrated about his own life, was having some resentment towards women in particular, towards feminism, towards gender equity, and they decided to take some lives away from women. They were targeting women, and these two events are considered to be Canada's largest mass massacres in recent or modern Canadian history. Now, when we speak about gender-based violence, of course, it is really important for us to define it. We consider gender-based violence to be a result of gender norms and expectations that are created through socialization, through culture, and that create unequal power relationships between genders in our society. It's really important for us to acknowledge that most violence is coming from male-identified folks. Most of the victims are women and folks who are gender divergent or members of the LGBTQ+ community. And our approach is to just engage in conversations with men, letting them know what they can do to end gender-based violence. The good news about working with male-identified folks is that we know most of them want to do something. We know most of them want to challenge sexism, right? In 2012, we did a study that we called the Ontario Men's Survey, which basically meant calling thousands of men across Ontario, asking them about their attitudes towards gender equity, gender-based violence prevention, and the response to the survey was really good. We know that most men across Ontario know that gender equity is a goal we should strive for. They know that sexism is bad. But when we asked them what they were doing in their own personal lives to end gender-based violence, they just thought that being good guys or not being violent themselves was enough, right? So although the response was really good, I'm sorry, I have my stress ball with me. Although the response was really good, most of them didn't really know what to do other than not being violent in order to prevent gender-based violence. Now we see that as an issue because we know that ending with violence requires male-identified folks talking about it, having conversations with their peers. As we're going to be discussing today, we know that men define what is permissible and what is not to their peers. We know that role modeling is key in ending gender-based violence. And we know that if men are not having any conversations, then we're not going to see any change in behaviors from other men. Now, I want to introduce the Drawline campaign. As I said, most of the knowledge and most of the examples I'm going to be bringing up throughout this webinar are coming from my own experiences leading this campaign in White Ribbon. Draw the Line was created in Ontario by the OCRCC and Action Ontarienne. These two organizations led the creation of the campaign. And then a number of organizations that you see at the bottom jumped on board and became part of this campaign, each one tackling different audiences and different goals. Our our participation in this campaign is to or relies on engagement at the post-secondary sector in sexual violence prevention initiatives, and focus on attitudinal change, that is challenging behaviors and attitudes that enable sexual violence, and also giving bystanders the tools and the knowledge that they require in order to stop sexual violence when it's already happened. And when we speak about sexual violence, of course, it is important to understand it lives in a spectrum. So when we speak about prevention and bystander intervention, we speak to things that happen at a conversational level, somebody making a sexist joke, to more to physical acts of sexual violence. So the agenda we usually cover throughout our workshops is pretty simple. I think it's standard for sexual violence prevention. It's something that I see a lot of organizations are doing. A lot of the initiatives are covering very similar material, right? We start with an introduction to our organization, then we define what sexual violence is. We go through some myths of that are common and perpetuated by rape culture in our communities. We cover things like most sexual violence cases are perpetrated by somebody the victim or survivor doesn't know. Of course, that's not true. Fake accusations are common. Of course, that's not true. All those myths we just unpack with participants. We make sure they have a clear understanding of what reality is. Then we move on to talking about gender expectations and how they enable sexual violence. We do an activity that I'll be speaking about later on during this webinar that is called the man box activity. In this activity, we unpack those gender expectations that we put on male-identified folks, and we talk about how those might be enabling sexual violence, and then we focus on 3 key concepts, right? And again, I think these are standard, and a lot of organizations are using them. So allyship, consent education, and bystander intervention. Now, here's just a brief slide on the outcomes of the Draw a Line for the last year, starting August of 2019. So far we've had 8 institutions working with us at the post-secondary level across Ontario. We've had more than 900 workshop participants, and our audiences are very varied. We try to work with male athletes, so we've had a couple of teams. We've had some residence staff. We've had first-year students. We've done assemblies with all the first-year students coming to some schools. And we've participated in consent weeks or events related to consent culture. We've had a really good response to our survey. So about half of all participants have responded our post-workshop survey. In this post-workshop survey, we asked 7 different questions. These are the 3 last questions that we ask, right? And folks can either agree or disagree with these statements. So we know that on average, 90.8 of responses indicate that folks agree or disagree with the outcomes of the workshop, with the goals of the workshops. And for these 3 statements that are related to bystander intervention and male engagement, the average is 90.5, so it's pretty close, right? This refer to doing something when somebody is being sexually assaulted or harassed. What are the options of a bystander, like calling someone, directly intervening, and so on. And the last one refers to the role that men and boys can play in ending gender response. So again, the response is really good. The other 10%, or most of the other 10% answers neither agree or disagree. And on average, for these 3 questions, only 6 people have clicked on disagree. Nobody has responded strongly disagree. So we're very happy about these results. And what I want to cover today is precisely how we got here, what things have worked for us, because as I mentioned, our agenda or our curriculum seems to be pretty standard, but there's a number of things that we do in order to get these results. Now, of course, it is also important to acknowledge that there might be some gaps. Of course, we don't have the capacity to do a long-term study of how attitudes were changed. We don't have the capacity. But so far, folks who respond this survey make it clear that their understanding of what they can do and how men can be included in this conversation is clear. So this is where we start with the content on best practices. These are some considerations that I encourage folks to always keep in mind when developing a campaign, when doing a workshop, when facilitating groups on campuses, or in general, that are going to be having conversations on male allyship and healthy masculinities. And these are things that are just always at the back of my head before entering any classroom, before facilitating any workshop. These are the things I considered are key to keep in mind. So I'm going to go through each one individually. So first of all, it's really important for somebody who's facilitating a workshop or creating a campaign to keep in mind that although we might be experts, although we might be used to having conversations, unpacking gender expectations, and we've gone through processes that are years long, our audience is not going to be there yet, right? Each one has like their own area of expertise, and we've chosen this one. For them, gender expectations and sexual violence might be normalized. And we see this through popular culture, we see this through social interactions at every level. These things are normalized, right? So on the left, you're going to see a graph of what we call the man box. It's an activity that I already mentioned. In this activity, usually folks would be asked to draw a square in the middle of a flip chart. And in the middle of that square, we're going to ask them to write all the things that a man has to be or do in order to be considered a real man. You know, we ask them to not write things that are asked of other genders. And then outside of that box, we ask them to write all the things that men are going to be called if they don't follow those mandates inside of the box. Right, so you can only imagine names and insults that are related to femininity and also homophobia, right? Unfortunately, these are terms that are used by young men to put each other down, right? And it brings a conversation about how we treat femininity and the LGBTQ plus community in our communities, and how sexism and homophobia still exist. But something that I also encourage folks to keep in mind is how these young men that are your audience ended up in these members, right? We know that we learn these attitudes through socialization, and it's very likely that, first of all, young men are put into this box by harassment and violence, right? Since we're kids in the classroom, we're going to be teased, we're going to be punished in one way or another if we don't follow the mandates of these members, right? And of course, it's not, it's unrealistic for everyone to follow all of the mandates inside of the box, but we do know that young men tend to look up to these values because it's what defines them, right? Our society is constantly telling them, your value comes from this, right? You're going to be valued if you're dominant. You're going to be valued if you're in control. You're going to be valued if you're a player. So that's something that I really encourage folks to keep in mind. It's not only some set of expectations that we put on people that are really easy to unpack. Each individual's journey is different, and many times this is going to this set of norms are going to be related to our self-esteem, how we value ourselves, our emotions. There's going to be some emotional attachment to these things, and it's likely that we admire somebody with this, right? So that's something to keep in. And if these are the characteristics that men are encouraged to have, then rape culture becomes the tools that a lot of men are going to use in order to prove that they have those characteristics, right? So it's important to know how embedded into culture it is, but also how a lot of people internalize these things, right? And this will give us some background in understanding the possibility of backlash or resistance when delivering workshops or any kind of programming in gender-based violence prevention or sexual violence prevention. The second consideration that I want to bring up is that Me Too has changed the conversations that we've had on sexual violence quite a lot, right? I think a couple years ago, sexual violence was the topic that a lot of people were not willing to go into when having a conversation. Sexual violence was something that was often ignored. There was a lot of shame. There was a lot of there were a lot of myths that were just being continuously perpetrated over and over again. And there were not clear guidelines or parameters in how to understand sexual violence. So Me Too came up a couple years ago, and we saw a boom in conversations on sexual violence, right? Of course, a lot of women coming up with their own situations on sexual violence. And in about 2 years ago, I'm seeing some questions, but I think the questions will leave for the end. And a couple of years ago, White Ribbon asked one of our consultants to do some research, some cultural scanning about what was happening with Me Too and how it was influencing men's behavior and men's attitudes. So the results are here. First of all, they told us that there's a culture of fear now in regards to talking and speaking out sexual violence. A lot of men are afraid of saying the wrong thing. A lot of men are not engaging in the conversation just out of fear of being punished in any way. And that is leading to less transformation of attitudes and behavior. And there might seem to be a demand of safe spaces where men can ask questions openly. Now, when we speak about Me Too, we also have to speak about the backlash that Me Too received, right? Because a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, a lot of narratives came against Me Too, right? As well as to support the movement, right? So we're seeing that a lot of points of references for men in regards to Me Too go back to the narratives that we see in what we call the manosphere. When we speak about the manosphere, we're talking about online communities that that might be frequented by men mostly, in which sexist attitudes are very common, right? Communities such as incels, men going their own way, red pillars, just men who have very sexist attitudes and have openly gone against Me Too, right? And I'm mentioning this because this will become important when you're engaging a male audience, right? Whereas before it was likely that a lot of people had not been engaged in the topic. Right now it is very likely that once you come into a classroom, everyone has heard of Me Too and everyone has an opinion about sexual violence and the movements that have come forward in order to eliminate it. And some folks are going to be on board with Me Too, and they're going to agree with a lot of stuff that is being said, and the goals of Me Too. And some folks are going to have other points of reference that are completely misleading and not conducive to have a conversation in order to end sexual violence. Now, when talking about boomerang effects and reactance theory, I want to go to two articles on this topic. One is let me just hide this box. One is by Neil Malamuth, Mark Humpin, and Daniel Lins, which explores the possibility of boomerang effects existing in situations of sexual violence prevention initiatives. And the other one is on the same topic, but looking not only at high-risk males, but also at males who are not considered to be high risk, and I'll be defining. So I'm going to start with the definitions. What is a boomerang effect, in case nobody has ever heard of this term? It refers to the unintended consequences of an attempt to persuade, resulting in the adoption of an opposing position instead. So, for example, somebody persuading you to, let's say, stop using a certain product or start using a certain product, and you doing the exact opposite, right? I'll just go through more examples in a bit. What they considered, and these two are quotes from this second article, are the causes of boomerang effects. First of all, the triggering of negative emotions, weak argumentation, large distance between the communicator and the listener's position, as well as threatened or reduced a threatened or reduced feeling of freedom, especially if the message receivers are adolescents or young adults, and let's see. Okay. So overall, when somebody is feeling like their freedoms are being threatened, they're more likely to respond with a complete opposition to that, to the message, and just do the opposite, right? So if we think, I'm sure most people can think of examples when going through this idea of the boomerang effect, right? Perhaps that's one of the reasons a lot of us used to smoke in our early 20s, right? It wasn't only to look like a cowboy, it was also to go against all those messages that we were receiving from our parents, our teachers telling us do not smoke, right? And many of these messages were perceived by us when we were young as limiting our freedoms, and we just wanted to do it, right? This could apply to messages that we receive on changing our eating behavior, on perhaps changing religion, politics, beliefs overall. I'm sure many of you can think of some examples. Now, I found a really good example on boomerang effects and reactance theory. So in psychology, boomerang effects are referred to as reactance theory. And this refers to someone's perception that their freedom is being threatened and experiencing an unpleasant, and consequently experiencing an unpleasant emotion called reactance. So in 1976, they did a short study, these two researchers, Penbaker and Sanders, in which they had two sets of messages that were going to be put across a college washrooms. In a set of washrooms, they put the sign, "Do not write on these walls under any circumstances." In a set of other washrooms, they put a sign saying, please do not write on these walls. So what do you think the result was? Of course, the washroom with sign 2 had significantly less graffiti, right? they came to understand that if the message was very limiting of someone's liberties and was very authoritative, then folks were a lot more likely to go against that same message. So it's important to think about the implications that these boomerang effects and reactance theory might have in our workshops, campaigns, and working with male-identified folks in general, right? I think there are a lot of common mistakes happening when developing messages, because we're not taking this into consideration. And again, this is just an area that is just being explored now. These two studies are from 2018, and both claim that we need a lot more research based on this, right? Now, something that I want to bring to your attention is that based on this on this knowledge on boomerang effects, we can see how initiatives can go pretty well, or can create the opposite effect, right? So it is important to have ongoing workshops. It is important to have ongoing campaigns. It is important to have male-identified groups in our communities having these conversations. But also, it is also important to acknowledge that if the effort that we put into this work is not tailored in a way that is taking into account these factors, then the result might be completely opposite. And we might be enabling sexual violence in our communities, right? So these are the things that I want to speak about when talking about best practices. These are the things that I think could prevent us from serious backlashes, from seeing this element of reactance in campaigns, workshops, and different programming when engaging men and boys. And again, these are based on our experience delivering Draw the Line. These are based on some previous research I had done on the backlash that each wave of feminism had received throughout history. And these are based also on the recommendations that are made in the papers that I just read. So I'm going to start with something that is pretty basic, something that many of you are probably already applying, which is representation and empathy. Of course, we know through research that audiences are a lot more likely to be receptive to a message when they feel represented by the speaker. So that's why we're often talking about the importance of having male-identified speakers address male-identified audiences. But when we speak about representation, we shouldn't only think about looking the same way or identifying with the same gender, but also really understanding where our students are coming from, right? Really understanding what your personality is like, what you're going through in your early 20s as a university student, all the problems and issues that go with that, right? And really remembering that and putting yourself in their shoes. Something I emphasize a lot is empathy. And it's a word that we use a lot nowadays, you know, but I've seen a lot of facilitators and I've seen a lot of specialists on masculinities making mistakes when delivering workshops and campaigns, right, in regards to empathy. For example, it is very common for folks to, and I've seen this on YouTube plenty of times, to, let's say, start a talk by making fun of masculinity, making fun of the traits inside of the box. It's also common to see facilitators, when doing the man box activity, laugh about the traits that are inside of the box. The problem with doing that is that although you're going to get some people laughing in the room, right? And people who are more open and receptive to your message are probably also going to be laughing. And it's something that it's common, because once you're unpacking social norms, you come to realize that many of them are outdated. Many of them don't make a lot of sense in 2020, right? But at the same time, you have to be careful of who else is in the room, and you have to realize, and that's going back to the first point that I brought when talking about those considerations, is that a lot of young men have a lot of attachment to these characteristics, right? And if you're laughing and if you're not offering empathy and you're not ready to listen, and instead are just bonding by attacking who they are in theory, then there's going to be resistance. Of course, something else that is important is no othering or no shaming, right? A lot of facilitators do come into classrooms with this idea of I'm going to teach you, or you and I are different, or there is the folks who have deconstructed themselves, or there is the folks who possess this kind of healthy masculinity versus there is these folks who possess this kind of toxic masculinity, right? It's a common mistake, and we do see it a lot. And I think it's common because once you realize the unhealthy traits that exist within this man box, a lot of people want to differentiate from them, right? So they try to deviate from them, and one of the ways they do it is by mocking it or othering themselves from them. But unfortunately, that doesn't work. Something that I think it's also very important, and this takes us back to the results of the research papers that I shared, is being aware of your audience and understanding that there is always going to be a spectrum of hostility and openness. We tend to think of male-identified audiences as being heterogeneous and perhaps just all the same, right? We tend to make generalizations, but it's really important to understand that there is usually going to be a normal distribution in ranging from like folks who are very hostile to the topic and folks who are very open to having the conversation. And something that I've noticed a lot is that when creating campaigns and delivering workshops, a lot of folks are going to say, well, you cannot save them all. Or they're going to say, well, at least talk to the ones who are paying attention, right? But one of the things that are suggested by this paper, and that of course caught my attention because it's something that I think had been applying from before, is that workshops and programming should be delivered targeting high-risk individuals, but giving it to everyone else, right? By high-risk individuals, we mean folks who are possibly more likely to perpetuate sexual violence because of their sexist attitudes, because of personality traits, how they've been raised. So how I usually see an audience is, first of all, understanding folks who are open to having the conversation, not as my target audience, but as folks who are going to facilitate with me that session. So let me just explain, unpack this a little bit. So folks who are open to the conversation are going to make the permission permissible. So for example, working with athletes, I'm going to sit them down and I'm going to ask them to join some groups. And one of the first things that I'm going to ask them is to define sexual violence, right? Folks who are on board are going to have a good idea of what sexual violence is. And instead of me coming into a classroom and defining what it is, they're each one giving permission to have the conversation. Folks who are on the side of being high risk or hostile are going to realize that it's not unmanly to have those conversations. They're going to realize that you can just be a regular guy and know about these things. They're going to make it permissible to talk about these things, right? So in a way, the folks who are open to have these conversations, they're going to be role models. And also, since I am targeting high-risk individuals in the way I speak, in the way I open up conversations, in my attitude, I am also being a role model to those folks who are open to have this conversation, for them to replicate the conversation in their own personal lives, right? The number one reason why folks who are on board with these topics don't have conversations in their own personal lives about sexual violence prevention and gender-based violence prevention is because they don't have the tools. They're afraid to say toxic masculinity. They're afraid of saying privilege because they know there's going to be a backlash. But what if I show them how to have the conversations without necessarily bringing those things up, right? I'm giving them the tools to have conversations with people who are hostile, right? Now, as I said, I'm talking, my target audience will be folks who are on the hostile side of the spectrum, right? A lot of my work is going to be based on on myth busting. It's going to be based on working with them and letting them know that the beliefs and conceptions that they had of the workshop and of the topic are really not true, right? So they're receiving an unexpected message. It's not going to be the things that they've seen online, the things that they've seen on Reddit and through the manosphere. It's something new, right? And that leads me to the third, sorry, point that I'm bringing up, which is myth busting and stereotype busting. We have to be aware that there is a lot of knowledge and narratives that are being spread about our work, and it's important to do some research beforehand. It's important to know that they exist and know that high-risk males are probably engaging with those, and then use them to our own benefit, right? You can just enter a classroom and in the moment do some myth busting, and that's going to create some expectation, and that's going to create some buy-in into the topic. For example, I usually start my talks with athletes saying, how many of you were dreading coming here? How many of you rolled your eyes at the topic of sexual violence prevention, right? And they're going to be open and say, me. And I tell them, you know what? Don't worry, this is not going to be what you expect. I do not come here with some moralistic preach about what to do and what not to do. Instead, I'm here to talk about like options. And I'm here to talk about how to make your own lives better and give you the tools to make the lives of others around you a lot better, right? So here in the examples, there are some narratives that are widely spread, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm not going to cover them all. I know I have 3 more minutes. But just unpacking those throughout the workshop, you know? Knowing that they exist and just letting them know that these are just cognitive distortions, that there are exaggerations of what's really going on, and that those exaggerations are just limiting their own behavior instead of us putting boundaries around themselves, works a lot. When thinking about the language to use in campaigns and in workshops, this is something that I recommend a lot. Of course, storytelling works great, and nuanced storytelling is best. When working with scenarios, just making sure that these are paragraphs that depict a specific story, a specific situation, instead of just one sentence. And again, making the conversation replicable, something that folks can have in their own personal lives, right? Something that happened with athletes was precisely like one of the coaches coming the next day to me and saying, well, it's interesting because just now in practice, they were having like a conversation about like the same topics. It seems like this is working, right? And so we do this by just being very positive about the topics which are heavy that we're bringing up, and giving them the tools to replicate them. Just knowing that although these are hard conversations, they can have fun and they can do them in a way that is just like chilling and just making each other better. And for the don'ts, I have just not using those very authoritative statements like men must, men should, men have to, men need to, right? Because instantly high-risk folks are going to say, you don't control my life, you're not going to limit my freedom, and they're going to do the opposite. And campaigns that use I statements. I found a paper with an example of a campaign that was #HowIWillChange, and these are often perceived as condescending. These are often perceived as some guy pretending to be a hero or a savior, talking down on men who are not on board, right? So those create a lot of like backlash. And lastly, throughout workshops, throughout campaigns, throughout messages, fostering authenticity, meaningful relationships, and leadership, right? If we know that high-risk males don't want to be limited in their actions, then we can tell them, well, look, this is what gender roles do, right? And you have now the opportunity, now that you know, now that you have had access to this knowledge, you can create a more authentic life. Now you have the skills to challenge everything that we've been telling you you must do, and you can choose for yourself what is best for you. And we also cover those consequences of male attitudes and expectations, right? You're more likely to create harm in your community. You're also more likely to create harm to yourself. You're more likely to end up lonely in life. You know, we're seeing a big crisis of loneliness in the West, especially for men, right? So what about if you own your life? What if you decide what is best for you, right? Also letting them know that their romantic and sexual relationships can be meaningful, and as well as friendships, right? There's a lot of myths, especially in incel circles, about the impossibility of having relationships in 2020, right? No, you can do them. It does require a sacrifice, and it does require change. But your value doesn't come from how many romantic partners or sexual partners you have. It, it's a lot more. It's a better goal to have meaningful relationships. And in regards to friendships, the same. Most guys are sick of having friendships that are based on putting each other down. They want meaningful experiences. So tell them about that. You have now the freedom to attain that. I covered the next point, and then accountability, right? You own your actions. You're free to do whatever you want, but you own your actions, and make sure that whenever you walk into a room, whenever somebody sees you, like they know who you are, right? Make sure that you are owning all of your actions. Oh my goodness. Okay, so now we're running out of time. I have a few questions. Now, I want to finish by sharing with folks the existence of the metric on sexual violence prevention. Just briefly, this is a self-assessment tool in which folks can just log into our website. They're going to complete a number of questions, and they're going to be able to get a self-assessment on what they're doing at their post-secondary level, or at post-secondary institution, sorry, to prevent sexual violence, how they can improve, what the gaps are, and they'll just end up with a document in which they'll be able to refer to whenever they're strengthening their approaches. So I just talked really quickly, and I'm going to pass it on to folks there in London, because
we're here. We caught that lateral pass, David. That was great. Thank you so much. And I'm not going to take any more time saying all the wonderful things I would like to say to you, because we have some great questions, and I want to use our last very brief moments to let you answer some of them. There's been people are wondering about younger children and wondering about younger like boys, not in the post-secondary, but in elementary. And could we be starting younger so that hopefully they don't move as far on that hostility scale or get as immersed in some of the unhealthy masculinities. Your thoughts?
Definitely. So we know it's key to start early. It's key to work with young folks. Something that we notice a lot through our work is that if you go to a grade 7, grade 8 classroom, a lot of young boys are going to know about these expectations. And for a lot of them, they're not going to make a lot of sense. They're just going to find them funny. They're going to still speak from a place in which they haven't received that pressure to feed into the man box, right? So I think giving them the tools to challenge the man box is key. But something that we've also noticed is that from grade 9 to 10, that's when the change starts, right? A lot of people are going to be very open in younger grades. Change once you move to grade 9 and 10, then that man box becomes a lot of pressure on your weight, right? So yes, starting early is key, but also continuing with that education is very important. Acknowledging that pressure and preparing those kids for that pressure that is going to come.
Yes. Okay, so we want it right through, across all developmental stages, but it would look different.
Yes, definitely.
One of the comments and question that has come in, that this participant in their presentations, the topic of false accusations comes up, and they're wondering, how do you respond to questions about or concerns about false allegations from the young men that you're working with?
Data. There is plenty of data suggesting that false accusations represent only like 4% of accusations, and that our legal system is very good at finding that they're false, right? So it's really a cognitive distortion. It's often exaggerated, the fear for those, and they're really not happening as much.
Okay, thank you, David. One of the comments, and I'm going to try and condense it, but is that wondering if whether in parenting or just adult peer interactions, do we have to wait until a young person realizes that it's okay to have these conversations? So it goes back a bit to what you've already answered. Before we start talking about masculine behavior or different kinds of masculinities and myth busting.
Mm-hmm. I think there is no age like when you should start. I think our kids from an early age are exposed to a lot of messages. You know, they're watching Disney movies in which in the ending everyone is happy and that myth of romantic love is perpetrated, right? So having conversation about what's real, what challenges there are in treating others, and what is healthy and what is not, shouldn't really have an age.
Okay. There's also a comment, have you heard of the golden bridge concept? It's a strength-based approach that allows people to let go of their behavior and comments that are inappropriate and retreat onto a golden bridge of being someone who is not sexist or inappropriate.
That sounds great. I will look into it. I've never heard of it.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay, we'll send you the person that they heard of this from. And then not sure though if that's the person who actually coined the term or developed the concept. Another question is, it relates to the rape culture pyramid, David, that you shared early in your presentation. And the question is, why is, quote, safe word violations considered as degradation rather than assault?
Let's see. Can you repeat that question? Okay, so
Yeah,
I would have to go back to the room. Okay.
Why is safe word violations, so they're taking that off the pyramid, why is it considered degradation rather than assault?
Okay, so that's from the pyramid.
Yes.
I'm really sorry. I would have to go back to the resource. If you just give me 1 second to just really like address this. So, the word violations. Why is it seen as
degradation as opposed to assault?
Oh, I see that. Okay. I would see him as assault, definitely. I think what the pyramid is showing is how assault is normalized. So I'm not sure if I can share my screen back and that image, but it's really not suggesting that some of these things are assault and some of them are not. It's just showing how some normalized versions of assault enable other versions of assault.
Yes. Okay. I think that helps a lot, the comment that you just made. And the temptation is to look at it as when you see the words on the sideline that they refer or relate to the words within the pyramid that are juxtaposed to them. So that's helpful, David. It really is. We are really out of time, but I just want to share with you, David, that there have been so many comments in the chat box about how much people are valuing the presentation that you made as you were making it, and sharing their appreciation. And our team want to express our appreciation. And I really value the way you didn't just tell us about what you did, but some of the strategies that you found to be more effective. And I mean, what will be exciting is someday when there's the resources to do the research to know if those beliefs, I feel I would know what to do if that translates into behavior. And we'll look forward to that exciting time, and perhaps you'll be part of that study someday.
Hopefully. So yeah, no, thanks a lot for having me. It was a lot of information in such a short period of time. But I hope it's helpful. And if folks have any questions, they can just like contact me through email. I'm happy to respond.
Very generous of you, David. Thank you so much. And we'll keep you posted as to what's next in terms of webinars and webcasts from our programs. So thank you, everybody. And don't forget the evaluation. The link will be in the chat box. And don't forget White Ribbon's evaluation for the Draw the Line, this presentation that they're asking you to do as well. And with that, again, thank you, David, and goodbye to everyone.